Does South Africa possess features of a failure? Well, the Fund for Peace Fragile State Index ranks South Africa 89 out of 179 countries, with one being the most fragile. For over 60 years, the Fund for Peace has been developing tools and approaches for reducing conflict with a focus on human security and economic development. In an article in the Mail and Guardian, public law expert Professor Calland argues that South Africa is far from being a failed state, which by definition is a measure of a government's authority to maintain control of what happens within its borders and secure its sovereignty. But is that perhaps too thin a definition of government's inability to deliver services, security and human development? Joining us now to discuss this a little bit further and gain the perspective is Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town, Calland, also political commentator Rebone Tau, and governance expert Sandile Swana. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Prof, let's start with you. In a sense, firstly, you argue that the continued rumor of a failed state could certainly affect sentiment, because if you look at markets, they react on sentiment, and this could certainly be harmful for the recovery process, also quite harmful for the livelihoods of South Africans. So you warn against that particular kind of rumor. But what other perspective can one have when you look at the latest crime stats? 6,083 murders in 3 months. 10,818 rapes in 3 months, 40,960 burglaries in 3 months. Only 5% of municipalities in South Africa are currently a going concern. It's like 64 of them are completely dysfunctional. Add to that, people broke into the president's house and stole money. We didn't even know about it until somebody let us know and went to the police. So when you look at the terms in terms of relevant literature, the feature of a failure, one of them, is of course an inability to enforce the laws that we make. And we are at that state where there's just widespread disorder and the lack of rule of law. Why should we not say we are at least quite high up at an alarming state of fragility?
Well, good evening, Taba. Thank you for organizing and hosting this important conversation. The trigger for my column was this, that one of my clients, wherein my Paternoster Group political risk business had, one of our multinational clients raised this question with us because back in headquarters in the parent company, they'd heard of this talk of South Africa becoming a failed state. They'd heard language about fragility. They'd heard of all of the sort of litany of complaints and problems, some of which you've just summarized very well. And they were concerned because, of course, they have investments here. They have employees here. They have a stake in this country. And the concern around that led them to ask the board of directors here in South Africa, what's going on? Is South Africa headed into failed state status? And so on their behalf, we looked into this. And of course, I'm reasonably familiar with the literature. And the academic literature is quite clear. South Africa is not a failed state. As you say, it's quite a thin definition academically. It's basically whether the state has a legitimate hold on the law and order, and on the security services. And in that sense, although it's absolutely clear that we're creaking at the seams, it's absolutely clear that the state of policing is not what it should be, and so on and so forth, we are a long way from being the sort of society where, for example, vigilante groups run amok, where people are unable to trust the state at all. So I appreciate there's huge frustration in the country. I appreciate there's real and genuine and understandable concern about the trends in South Africa. But we must be careful when we use phrases like failed state and bandy them round without being careful about what they really mean and about the implications on, for example, the investment environment and business confidence.
So in your assessment then, as you looked at that particular question, which part of the state, because you're saying maybe government may be failing, but not the state, which part of the state is still intact?
Well, that's right. It's important to distinguish between party, government, and state. So, for example, we can be highly critical of a particular leader or a particular political party. We may feel they've lost the plot, they're not doing what we would expect of them. But we have to look beyond that. We have to look at the institutions of state. And let's take one very important example, the rule of law. Yes, there are problems with law and order, there are problems with policing and so on, but the court system is essentially working well, especially at the higher end and the high courts and above. And we've seen it having been stress tested over the last 10 years, thanks to the Zuma administration and its abuse of power. We now know that the Constitution is more than a piece of paper. We know the courts are fearless in their independence. They're willing to apply the law as they see it, and indeed they have done. Now, that is a long way away from being a failed state, and I can assure you that. And anyone who's traveled and visited places, and it's perhaps not necessary to mention them, but you can think of a number of places around the world. Some of them have been conflict-strewn, some have been have suffered civil war or invasion, and so on. Places where really there is no law and order, and where the state is conspicuous by its absence.
Dr. Swana, the societal impulse would say that the state at least is showing symptoms of some kind of failure, particularly based on the failure to deliver against aspirations. Are they motivated to say so? Is there a lack of opportunity for people to that extent that they can say we are at a state of fragility? And of course, the question around government authority and government being able to enforce rule of law.
Well, I've just described one aspect of the state.
So sorry, Prof. That was for Mr. Swana.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Forgive me.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me quickly jump in. If we're talking about, just to also respond to the first question that was not asked directly to me, is the simple fact that multinational corporations operate all over Africa. They even operate in war zones. So to actually advise them whether they can continue to do business in a particular area is relatively easy, because they've got ways of operating in failed states in the first place. Let's put it that way. The issue of South Africa, I listened as part of preparation for this interview to Mark Haywood, who was speaking at Gibbs, University of Pretoria, I believe it was, 5 years ago, talking about a failed state under Jacob Zuma at the time. There was a parallel state. Our state has been captured. The issue of state capture is beyond doubt, meaning that the state says it is running the state, but there's another group of private people who are running the state. So you have two parallel states in one country. So to me, that is a significant indicator of failure already. It's a sign of failure. Two, when you look at the infrastructure, is it report card from our engineers? Because part of what the state must do is to render the basic services. The only categories which meet the A score, which is that they are up to standard really, and are not fragile, would be the airports and the national roads. Every other type of infrastructure and related services is fragile or is at the risk of failure at any given moment in time. We've seen sewage at Mfuleni coming back. You flush the toilets and it flushes into your house. And that is not the only place we've seen disinvestment. And as a person who's grown up in this country, I was a student at WITS. Today, WITS is fenced in from every direction because security has totally collapsed. You can be raped at WITS or any other university. Computers can be stolen. Everything is locked. And when I was a student there was no such a thing. Shopping centers are locked because the security forces, the law enforcement, is basically collapsed in South Africa in more than one way. The judiciary is fighting a bitter battle of survival. So my view is that when you look at what Padile Hutla had to say, the former statistician, that one now in the Gwara scenario. Recently, on the 28th of May, David Mabuza said Because of the slow pace of land reform in South Africa, we are headed towards a state of anarchy and destruction. Our title deeds in South Africa, if you say you are a property owner, it's allowing that people can invade your property and take it away from you. Land ownership is in question in South Africa, etc., etc., etc. The thing is disintegrating. I'm not saying it's a failed state. It is decidedly a failing state, and it needs to be rescued.
We'll come back and answer that question exactly. How does it become rescued? But Rebone, let's bring you in here. Overall lack of ability to execute against its own vision, the African National Congress. To what would you attribute that pattern of perpetual failure?
Good evening, Tau, and good evening to the viewers at home. I would want to agree with Prof. Richard, that it's not a failed state, South Africa, but there's challenges. And indeed, the internal politics of the ANC are really making things difficult in terms of governance in this country, in terms of service delivery that Sandile has just spoken about, because the ANC is more focused on their own internal politics. And we know even right now, between now and December, the focus is going to be about the conference, less about issues of governance and service delivery. So this really puts us in a very difficult situation as a nation, because now we have to now look at the movie that's playing in South Africa around the ANC, when we know that there's a lot of challenges that our people are going through. We know the unemployment rate that is high, not only because of COVID, but also the economy that is also growing at a very slow pace. But the reality of the matter is that we need a political will, and currently the ANC is not taking that leadership, as the ANC always claims that it is a leader of society, and we're not seeing the ANC anywhere in society to take up that leadership role that it says it has in society.
Yeah, and what's the chance then of the country surviving? I mean, can the state still remain functional with an ANC that is plagued by internal factions and disunity?
I think what I like about South Africa, our democracy, we saw it in 2021 with the ANC continue to lose more municipalities, some we know that are in coalition, but the question is, are those coalitions working? So also not around the ANC only, but also all the political parties. Do we have political parties that can help, those, especially at local government at this present moment? Because the biggest problems also that we're facing, it's at local government. Yeah.
Prof, listening to Sandile Swana and then having to go and speak to corporate South Africa who are seeking reassurance, you might have a little bit of an uphill battle there with the number of things that he is teasing out. One of them being just a lack of social cohesion. And there is, of course, that racial nationalism that we are beginning to see. Maybe let's start there, and then we'll talk about the lack of security of tenure, which he also raises. One of the features, one of the impulses that tell you that there is something amiss here, based on some of the literature that we look at, racial nationalism or a lack of social cohesion, which we have seen. We are talking now largely what is happening in Stellenbosch, but of course we've seen other instances as well.
So it's an interesting discussion. And the first thing I would say in response to your question now is that if I was to stick to a kind of tight, narrow academic lane on this issue, it's very clear from the academic literature that South Africa is a long way from meeting the quite strict test and criteria related to being a failed state. And let's be clear, it's an absolute term of art. It's not a relative one. And yet, if one was to travel to places like Somalia or to Yemen right now, to various other places around the world, then one would see something very, very different to what we have in South Africa for all the many faults. Yeah. But Prof. Swana, of course, makes a very strong argument. And what I appreciate about his point, and I think he draws attention to this, is, of course, as Thabo Mbeki once put it, we live in two South Africas, two economies, two worlds. And that inequality means that for middle-class folks like me, it's all very well to say, well, actually, things are not too bad, services are still run, my dustbin is picked up every Thursday outside my house, etc., etc. Meanwhile, in working-class areas, life is very much more precarious on every possible level. Quality of services, danger, human security, and of course economic opportunity. On all of those indicators, life is fragile. And so in those circumstances, it is right and proper to continue to assert the view that the state must do more, the government must do more. But even if it is not a failed state, therefore, we should not be in any way complacent, far from it. We should be pointing out, as my colleagues here have done, the weaknesses, the growing fragility or the growing precariousness of South African life. And we have to pull together to ensure that the government can rebuild institutions and deliver the kind of rights and opportunities that the Constitution promises people.
So how do you tell a South African watching us tonight to say, I hear your argument, Prof, but how do you say to me when I look at the governing capacity of a failed state, but you saying it's not a failed state? I'm sitting here, I don't have security of tenure, I don't own a piece of land, right? And I don't have a hope that it will actually happen with the capacity of government that is currently in place. What do I hold on to say, oh, no, it's not failed?
Well, I appreciate that's a hard position to be in. And of course, in that circumstances, to use the really annoying cliche that the UN has used over the last few years in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, no one should be left behind. So in South Africa, as in a way it has always been the case, there are those who benefit from government and from the state, and those who get precious little from the state and from government. And that's clearly wrong and unjust. And that social justice issue is really lies at the heart of our Constitution. It requires society and economy to do more. And I believe that the greatest danger to South Africa is not the security situation. It is not questions of law and order. It's what lies behind all of that, which is this driving, fearsome inequality gap.
Yeah. And are you saying, for example, commerce doesn't have the ability and the tools to see through whatever form of artificial reassurance we can try and bring to them? When they look at that, they're not particularly concerned about these developments?
When who, sorry?
When commerce, when players in commerce, yeah.
Well, I think when investors or analysts, market analysts or business folk in South Africa pause for thought and actually think about the situation in its entirety, there are no doubt many frustrations and many complaints and laments about the trends, systemic and governmental and other, that are getting in the way of business, getting in the way of the economy growing in an inclusive fashion. All of that is justified criticism. But on the other side of the balance sheet, there are an array of institutions in South Africa that still work and that are a very, very long way away from being a failed state. The ability of the state to collect taxes, the fact that there are financial markets, the fact that despite all of the problems, people still get a welfare payment. There is an active, may not be perfect, but there is a working welfare state in South Africa. 17 or more million people get a welfare payment. It may not be enough. It's wrong that there's so many people who are dependent upon that welfare payment. But the fact that there is that working welfare state is evidence that this is a state that is capable of delivery.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we continue a little bit more on this conversation then and look at some of the other features, limited systems of accountability and how that could drive us even further into fragility. But also, is our democracy a real democracy, not just in the face of it, but the inner stuffings of this democracy? When we continue next, stay with us.
With all honesty, I'm thinking that we just need to reset the whole system, because it has been proven that it's not working. But the only thing that is happening, things are just getting worse and worse and worse.
I do think South Africa is a failing state. I think it has always been. It tries, but the expectations that are always set for us and are given by our government, they never really met. And we're always in a constant chase of trying to see improvements, and those never really come forward.
Back with you tonight in this conversation, Associate Professor in Public Law, University of Cape Town, Richard Calland, political commentator, Rebone Tau, Governance Expert Sandile Swana, still with us. Sandile, let's come to you now. How do we sustain that argument that Professor Calland is raising to say, well, try and look at places like Yemen, Somalia, and Syria, and Chad. Then you can talk to us about a failed state. A failed state is an obsolete. It's a complete state of catastrophe, and we are not there yet.
I think Prof. Calland actually answered the question, because Thabo Mbeki did provide the answer, that in South Africa, it's two nations within one territory. The 92% of the population live in absolute and total desperation. The other 8%, which is white, if you are a white South African, it is difficult, the average European, to be direct, the average European in Europe, in terms of educational achievements, does not compete with the average South African. South African whites compete with South Korea, which is leading the world in terms of attainments and today. So the world of white people in South Africa and their businesses, farms and everything else, and gated estates, is very different to the world of the 1.3 million people in Soweto who live in a negative economic growth, where you can be stabbed. Walking out of your yard, you can be stabbed to death. You can be raped. Anything can happen to you in Alex, Tembisa, Khayelitsha, and so on. So the majority of the population is actually living in a totally different world. So the question now is that if somebody is coming from outside and he calls himself an investor, whatever they want to call themselves, what are they coming to here? Are you looking at it from the side of those investors, or are you looking at the lived daily life of the South Africans, their vulnerability? How many cases are not reported to police stations? How many people trust police? For instance, my own daughter says, you know, Dad, when I see a police van, I become nervous because most of these vans are actually occupied by criminals. And so on and so forth. You understand that if you are in school in Soweto, after all these years of democracy, the school in Soweto does not compete with the school in Randburg. The school in Soweto struggles to keep pace with the schools in Africa. The other schools, a student from Soweto struggle to compete with other African students who are living in countries that we despise, if you like. So when people talk about high standards of education in South Africa, they're talking about the standards in the suburbs and in the white community. Black people know nothing about that as we speak today. When you talk about the 17 million people who cannot generate a proper income, as they should, who are getting cash grants from the state, it's a failed economic system. The South African economic system is beyond debate. It's a failed economic state of the economy. There's no economy that's supposed to run like this. It's a disaster. So that is where I would end it for the sake of brevity.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's exactly those issues that you're raising. And Prof is saying, well, look, there is a social services. People are still paying taxes. Taxes are being collected daily. We have courts that work. We have a constitution that stands, that's able to take people through the law and find them guilty. We are seeing even now with, for example, state capture report, people being mentioned there, beginning to see the doors of the courts. That is signs that we still have a state that works. But as you put it, I mean, how do you say that to people who are sitting day in and day out in poverty, or the 800 people in the Vaal who've been kicked out of land and they have no place to go, to say, well, the system is still working, there are still courts in this country, when you've been sitting outside in the cold in the middle of winter for a whole week?
Let's understand that in some of these provinces, and I like the idea that the statistics are starting to be actually stated in this fashion, whereby some of the provinces now, you have more people, the number of people that is increasing and exceeds the number of employed. The unemployed are exceeding. The number of the unemployed is growing, exceeding the employed in some of the provinces. Now, it's one thing to look about where you are today, but you've got to see where you're going. Whether what you are looking at is an oncoming trend. Every country that is about to prosper, you see escalating quality of education en masse. You see increasing inventions, innovations. You see increases in productivity. In South Africa, those indicators are going in the wrong direction. And that is why I didn't say South Africa is a failed state. I said it is a failing state. And the unfortunate part of it is that the likes of Mark Haywood were saying this 5 years ago already, in 2017, during the Zuma era. Where are we? How deep in the mess are we by now? And very recently, Badili Hotla said, we're now in the Gwara state, in the Gwara scenario.
What is the state of a democracy, Rebone, as viewed by the African National Congress? I mean, do they still believe that we have a democracy, or we have a democracy on face value? Do we have the inner stuffings of a democracy, or things just appear to be democratic?
I think before I go there, I would want to differ, Tabo, with Sandile. I was born and bred in Soweto. I grew up in Soweto. And the picture that is painting about Soweto is so painful. Because Soweto, yes, does have challenges, but let's not treat Soweto as like it's a last hope that it has never produced even a lot of celebrities, a lot of people in the entertainment industry, soccer, academics. I take that as very misleading to the nation. We look at today, this government that we're criticizing, how many students have been produced in different universities coming from villages, from townships, through the NEFSAS, which has been provided by the state, you know. But coming back to the issue of democracy, Tabo, one thing I can say is that there is democracy. And I'll give a typical example of the most recent elections, using Makana municipality as a case study. Looking at the outcomes of that municipality, a new party was formed, which is the Makana Citizens Front, and they got 5 seats, you know, in the municipality. If the ANC was not a party that believes in democracy, the ANC would have even stolen elections from 2016 local government elections, when the ANC was Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, you know, and Nelson Mandela. We don't see, like in other countries where opposition leaders are abducted, are killed. You know, we can just speak about Zimbabwe next door. We know that they're going to the elections in 2023, you know, and a lot has been happening, even now with the most recent by-elections in Zimbabwe on the political violence. So within South Africa, we can say that at least the ANC allows the democracy in this country. With the issue that Prof. Richard spoke about, the Constitutional Court, I mean, President Zuma, as the former head of state, was found guilty at the time when he was president by the Constitutional Court on the issue of Nkandla. You know, he had to pay back the money. That was a court decision. You know, we can go back now to the July unrest, you know, the Constitutional Court, because he had not appeared before the Zondo Commission. The ANC did not come in and protect and interfere in the judiciary. You know, so that shows how the ANC really is respecting the democracy in this country.
Prof. Calland, let's talk about the question also that you raised, particularly around the trust in the ability of the state to protect our borders. And there's been, of course, a bigger conversation around the porosity of our borders and what we are failing to do there. Is that feature of failure not severe enough in your view at this particular point? Is it something that we can still recover from and come back from?
Well, clearly, it's another symptom, yes, of a state and a government that is struggling to execute its own policies. That much is clear. I don't think there's any dispute about that. And I want to be absolutely clear, even though I'll continue to argue for the rest of this program that from an academic perspective, South Africa is not a failed state, and I think my 2 colleagues agree with me. What we're really debating is the extent to which it is failing, or the extent to which it is heading in that direction. And there I think that more or less there's agreement that there is fragility or growing fragility, at least for some members of our community, a large number in fact, the working class, and that as it has always been, middle class folks in South Africa get a lot out of the state compared with working class people. That's clearly a failure, but it's not state failure. It's a failure of governance, it's a failure of economic policy, and it's a failure to execute what may or may not be good intentions of policymakers who perpetually remind us and tell us that they want to do better on that front. But after 28 years in government, have to a large extent failed, it seems to me, and have certainly run out of ideas in terms of building the economy in a way that creates jobs and creates sustainable economic opportunities. And one of the areas of fragility that concern me, or growing fragility, is a global one. It's a system trend, and it's a pressure system around climate change. And we know the evidence is there, from droughts to flooding, that South Africa is vulnerable, and that apparently we are unable to muster the right choices around climate-smart infrastructure. We're unable to realize that decisions taken about planning permission, property development in KZN will affect everybody. And in fact, my previous column for the Mail and Guardian a month ago talked about that. And it talked about how for the first time with the KZN flooding, you saw middle-class housing estates, the gated community that Prof. Swana spoke about earlier, being affected, not as much, but being affected in a quite serious fashion, as well as working class areas where the infrastructure simply isn't up to coping with that kind of flooding. That's a real fragility, and it's a global problem, and it's one that South Africa needs to wake up to very, very quickly, and it needs to put to bed any ideas of continuing to use coal in the long term. We have a collective responsibility globally to move out of fossil fuels, because if we don't, the planet is going to continue to heat to the point where in 100 years it will be largely uninhabitable by human beings.
We continue in a moment with our guest tonight. Has President Cyril Ramaphosa's ability to execute a turnaround completely diminished, or can we still arrest the decline?
We just all need to work harder and together to build up South Africa.
Back with you tonight in this conversation as we ask that question. Is South Africa showing features of failure? These features featuring high enough in the fragility index for us to be concerned. And of course, asking the question that many people seem to be asking these days, is South Africa a failed state? Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town, Professor Richard Calland, political commentator Rebone Tau, and governance expert Sandile Swana with us. That's one. President Cyril Ramaphosa, I know we are talking a lot about him this week around the allegations of misappropriated money on his farm, or stolen money on his farm, and whether or not he's guilty. We'll get into that in the next hour here on the show as we ask Amabungane as they give us what they are discovering. But I mean, when you look into all those things and the kind of what they call the fight back that he was going to face coming into this administration, does he still have the ability to execute a turnaround? Or has his ability completely diminished?
I think we need to actually have a realistic view of a turnaround. I think a turnaround is possible, and I think a turnaround is going to happen. But I think we're looking for the turnaround in the wrong place. I don't think our turnaround is going to come from Cyril Ramaphosa. I think it's part of the continuing disaster in South Africa. The local government elections last year signaled to us that there are alternative ways of rescuing the country from being a failed state. So, for instance, a lot of the metros, I think in Gauteng, are already in the hands of the coalition, which deliberately excludes the African National Congress. And probably Gauteng, which is the largest economy probably in Africa really, as a province and so on, a driver certainly of the SADC region, is probably going to go to the coalition in 2024. So that is the turnaround. That is the true, genuine turnaround of South Africa. Not anything that Cyril Ramaphosa is going to. Cyril Ramaphosa is incapable, no matter what he does, of actually turning the situation around. Number one, there was an insurrection in July. The leaders, the ringleaders of that insurrection, are not in court, they are not in prison. In a properly functioning state, with a proper cabinet, that issue should have been attended to, and the cases, but it's almost 12 months now, the cases should already be reaching finality. You had all kinds of harassment of the president, banning of parliament, switching off lights here and there, and all sorts of attacks on infrastructure, and continuing like the countryside of South Africa is being daily denuded of Eskom infrastructure, electricity distribution lines, railway lines, everything that you can that would constitute the material side, the physical side of our civilization, is being physically removed from the surface of South Africa. And let me add that I'm a born Sowetan. So we used to use those trains from Soweto to town. I mean, we used to take tolls to the East End in the trains. You can't do that today. Those things are gone. So Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't have the speed that is required, the determination, the steely determination that is needed to turn South Africa around. But I am very confident that we are going to turn South Africa around. And the coalitions that are going to be formed are actually pointing towards a proper and correct solution of the future for this country, not Ramaphosa.
Rebone, you know the ANC prides itself as being the leader of society, but has it lost its coercive power as leader of society, and will it be able to regain that?
Mintabo, that is not even a question that you can ask. We've seen over the years, how people have been frustrated with the ANC, and sometimes they like to argue that when people don't go out, it's a sign that people still love the ANC. That is a sign that that the people actually have lost appetite in voting. And this is not only in South Africa. You look at the global patterns. In terms of the vote numbers, they're always very low. But the ANC is no longer a leader of society. They still live in a dream, thinking that they're a leader of society. I don't think that any leader that would win the conference in December of the ANC will really make a difference, going to 2024. President Ramaphosa has been in government since 2018 as the President of the Republic. And I'm still to see even one SOE where they can say this was a pilot project and this is where we have really improved in terms of this SOE, because we all are waiting now to see which SOEs are going to be sold, as he had indicated in his Swana. Literally, he's just rendering everything to private sector. He has said himself that the private sector should create jobs. So really, I don't think that the ANC still plays that role that it should be playing in society. And it will take a special kind of ANC, because the ANC of today is no longer the ANC of yesterday. The ANC of today is no longer really on the ground with the people. It's more about opulence and being discharged from the reality of the people on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and understanding the struggle of the people on a day-to-day basis. And indeed, as Sandile says, that in 2021, that was a clear, and I agree with Sandile, 2024, the ANC is not going to win Gauteng. If they win, it will be by a very small margin. But we've seen the patterns in 2019, we've seen in 2021 that indeed 2024 Gauteng is going. And that means now the ANC will be formally a rural party, because then they don't have Western Cape, they don't have Gauteng, so they'll only have the rural provinces.
Prof. Calland, let's wrap it up this way. If you were to ask the former president and ask him of a failed state, he'll tell you that, well, first, what is a state? So it would have to be the executive, it would have to be the judiciary, it would have to be parliament. So if we are saying we have a failed state, all those institutions would need to have failed. Are they all functioning the way that they should, or is maybe one that will be the saving grace to help arrest the decline?
Well, Thabo, none of them are working perfectly, but clearly, as I argued earlier, the judiciary is, in my view, doing an excellent job. The magistrates' courts, I know, are fragile in some places. They need a great deal of attention, but certainly from the High Court up, I think its institutional infrastructure there, certainly when compared with many other countries, it's a comparative advantage that it has, its strength of rule of law in that sense. Of course, in terms of policing, as we've discussed already, that's a problem. The law and order on the street, the law and order or lack of it that ordinary South Africans experience on a daily basis is nowhere near what it should be. That much is clear. And the socioeconomic precarity, the lack of hope, the joblessness and so on, that drives that kind of lawlessness, I think is the root cause. And that's what's wrong, and that's what needs to be addressed and taken care of. The legislature, well, it failed during the Zuma years. It failed to hold the executive to account. It was conspicuous by its absence in terms of its oversight function. And Zondo has dealt with that. And I think his final report, when it comes out later this month, will deal with that and will, I hope, make some suggestions as to how to insulate members of Parliament in the future so they can play a more independent role and not be so fearful of their bosses in the ruling party, although it applies to opposition parties as well. The executive, well, it's an interesting one because the Ramaphosa clearly has in many ways lost faith or lost trust with his cabinet. He's increasingly putting experts and building the presidency because he thinks that's the way to get the job done, rather than through the departments and through cabinet ministers. So there is a real problem in terms of executive capacity and power. And of course, much of that stems from the fact that during the 9 years of Zuma, the state was hollowed out. The good people left in their droves because they didn't want to be part of such a corrupt project. It became a really unpleasant, fearful place to work. And therefore, the capacity of the state at departmental level has been greatly diminished in the last 10 years.
So what's your prognosis, Prof? A quick 20 seconds. Will the decline maintain, or will the turnaround really bite?
Well, much depends, and I know that Ramaphosa has his critics. I know that, as Professor Swana earlier put it, he doesn't seem to lead with the decisiveness and the boldness required. But I suppose much will hinge, as ever, on the ANC conference in December. He not only needs to win, he needs to win big in terms of getting a much more loyal National Executive Committee, a united top six, so that he can get the ANC off his back, frankly, and govern for the country and not govern for the ANC. And then in his second term, maybe he'll be bolder, maybe he'll be more effective. That remains to be seen, of course.
Appreciate your time. Thank you all for coming on this evening. Sandile Swana, Rebone Tau, Professor Richard Calland. Of course, that conversation is one that is definitely continuing in the public domain.